We're back with Middle East Now. A series of interesting statements from Lebanese President Michel Aoun on energy, talks with Israel and southern Lebanon. For more, we are here with Owen Alterman, I-24 News International Affairs Correspondent. Hi, Owen.
Good evening.
What are the messages from the president?
Yeah, Aoun was visited by UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who met with him, with other leaders in Lebanon, although some have sarcastically said did not meet with the real leader of Lebanon,
right.
Hassan Nasrallah, of course, the head of Hezbollah. But at any rate, they gave a press conference. Aoun was asked about Israel and asked about the talks over the maritime boundary between Lebanon and Israel. Here's what he had to say.
When it comes to the situation with Israel, I reiterated to His Excellency the commitment of Lebanon to continue with Resolution 1701 and all of its aspects, maintain stability on the southern border, and the cooperation between the Lebanese army and UNIFIL. I also emphasized the Israeli violations on land, air, and sea, and primarily the use of Lebanese airspace to target Syria.
Yeah, so there we have it, Jacob. But another part of the press where he did talk about these maritime border issues and said he does want to continue the talks with Israel, although, as you could hear from there, no love lost between the two countries, or at least that's what Aoun needs to say before the cameras because of his own political needs back home. At any rate, of course, we heard the usual list of Lebanese complaints, if you will, gripes, issues that they want to put on the table as they see their issues with Israel. But it's really the border dispute that I think is getting a lot of attention because that's the man biting the dog, if you will. This is a case of Lebanon and Israel indirectly having talks with each other and the Lebanese being willing to do it because just how important it is to draw that maritime boundary between the two countries.
Right, and that has been going for quite a while.
They've been going for quite a while. Just a reminder, viewers, there's gas under those waters in the eastern Mediterranean, but there's no negotiated border between the two countries, and that matters because foreign companies are not going to be willing to go in and drill for gas if they don't know whose gas it is, particularly if they don't know whose gas it is between two countries that have been in a state of war for 70 years. So the two countries need to set that boundary for those companies to be able to come and get that gas out of the ground. And obviously, a more pressing issue, Jacob, for Lebanon than it is for Israel, given the collapse of the Lebanese economy, but also important for Israel. So to make a long story short, the United States is organizing indirect talks. The current American mediator has reportedly told both sides he's going to be giving up in March. If they don't come to a deal by March, he's going to walk away. Two sides have been far apart. Claims in Jerusalem that the Lebanese have dug their heels in on some very extreme positions that don't have a real basis in international law, but obviously a story that's to be continued.
Right. Now, President Aoun also spoke about southern Lebanon, which is obviously a very touchy issue with Israel. Now, President Aoun is a Maronite Christian. This is part of the unique political structure in Lebanon. Can he deliver the Hezbollah in the southern border?
Yeah, it's obviously a question. Again, just to remind our viewers that the Lebanese system, as you mentioned, Jacob, is organized on sectarian grounds, and the president under the Lebanese quasi-constitution must be a Christian. So he must be a Christian, and that must be filled by a Christian. But at the end of the day, this is a country that in terms of its politics is divided into two camps, the pro-Hezbollah and anti-Hezbollah camp. And Aoun is an ally of Hezbollah, at least at this stage of his long and varied political career. And yes, there is a question of what exactly would Hezbollah do or say if there were to be a deal, right? And there's a question of whether Hassan Nasrallah wants a deal or wants the issue as something to fight over. And one can see it both ways. On one hand, he does brand Hezbollah as the resistance, and so wouldn't want to be seen as getting on board with any deal with Israel. On the other hand, Lebanon really needs the money from this gas, and it won't get it until there's a deal with Israel. So maybe Nasrallah, a question, would want the plausible deniability of not being part of the talks, but not wanting to stand in the way and allowing the government to do it. And he's had some statements saying, this is for the government to decide, I'm not getting involved. Again, at the end of the day, will that be his position, or is this an issue he's going to want to fight about and not going to want to be resolved?
Right. He was also complaining about the Israeli airstrikes in Syria, airplanes going over Lebanese skies. Nothing's going to change about that.
Yeah, I mean, Hezbollah is the resistance, as Hassan Nasrallah calls it, and so he needs to resist. And as he sees it, he is resisting Israel, so obviously he's going to want to continue to find issues to use as a basis for conflict against Israel. That's why there's never been any hope in Israel about really reaching any kind of understanding with Hezbollah, because their entire raison d'etre, if you will, of course, standing up for Shiites within Lebanon as they see it, for their rights within the Lebanese system, as we just talked about, but also, again, branding it as a resistance to Israel and trying trying to win soft power and, of course, Iranian support by doing that as well. The question, more interesting question we just talked about, is what would that mean for this issue of the maritime border? Because, again, if you're a resistance and you want to resist, you certainly want to resist a deal with the Zionist enemy. On the other hand, you need the money from the gas, and the only way to get it is by drawing that boundary. So might Hezbollah want to look the other way? It's an open question, but again, we're not at the point where there is a deal yet. At the moment, Lebanon is taking out an extreme position, maybe at Hezbollah's urging, but this looks like it will have to get resolved sooner rather than later, at least according to what the U.S. envoy, or the current U.S. envoy, has told the two parties.
Yeah. So far, though, we have seen years and years of relatively quiet border between Israel and Lebanon.
Yeah, and of course the ongoing question in our minds in Israel is just the quiet before the storm. Hezbollah is both quite an arsenal in Lebanon. It's not an arsenal that Israel can really dent. The focus has been a kind of containment, if you will, over the course of the last decade, trying to avoid Hezbollah's getting more precision weapons, being ferried to it through Syria, again led to all those airstrikes in Syria that are reportedly the work of the Israeli Air Force. But at the end of the day, Hezbollah, as you know, Jacob, is so strong and so entrenched in southern Lebanon. The real power behind the country, of course, a controversial one inside Lebanon, but one that really has such a significant arsenal that it's not something Israel can meaningfully dent. Again, can contain, but not meaningfully dent. And this certainly is a festering issue. And of course, the concern is, or the suspicion is, that once the Iranian nuclear issue comes to a head, at the judgment day for that issue, whenever it comes, that Hezbollah is the real tool that the Iranian regime would have to use against Israel and could lead to a large and very, very dangerous confrontation between the two sides.